Welcome, everyone, to Fragile Future. This is a series of long-form conversations that examine the societal dynamics of planetary scale transitions in a really nuanced way. Fragile Future is a collaboration between Dark Matter Labs and the Future of Good. Dark Matter Labs works to demonstrate alternatives to existing economic, governance, regulatory, and policy systems in a range of contexts all over the world. Future of Good works to enable a smarter social purpose world by unlocking the potential of changemakers everywhere through insightful journalism and learning experiences on transformations shaping the next decade of social impact. Deep down at Future of Good, we believe that without smarter social purpose teams, there will be no significant progress on the deep challenges and transitions of our time. Indy, I'm so thrilled again about this conversation and about our ongoing collaboration. It's been a few months and lots has happened, so I'm really excited to get right into it. And again, this is I've got a couple of prompts for us to get into, but I want to also leave it for this to be a generative conversation. So perhaps we can get right into it. Is that all right?
Be delighted to be here, Vinod. Thank you for all the great work that you guys do as well.
Super. Yeah. So in our conversation today, I'd like to examine three philosophies with you. And in this era of great transitions, humanity requires a number of new philosophies. And there are three in particular that I'd like to examine today. It really feels like we need a new philosophy of commodification, consumption, and commercialization. So let me start off with some grounding. So just about 2 weeks ago, Canada hosted the fourth session to negotiate a global plastics treaty. It was hosted by the UN Environmental Program, and the intention was to develop an internationally legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. It was a massive, multi-day negotiations. About almost 3,000 delegates participated. It's about representing about 170 members, and about 500 observer organizations were involved, NGOs, etc., a range of other UN entities. And this was the fourth in a hopefully a set of five, and the fifth and final hopefully negotiation session will be held in Busan in South Korea. And the session in Canada, which was just a couple of weeks ago, and the sessions prior to this were really about advancing the text of the treaty, right? So not so much the underlying philosophies and mental models, right? So there were talks on emissions and releases, production, product design, waste management, avoidable plastics, all those kinds of things. And I don't necessarily want to talk about plastics here, but I use this global treaty and the conversations, the global conversations and the global discussion as an analog. Because the generational scale transitions we find ourselves in actually require new philosophies of commodification, commercialization, and consumption. And today we have a very specific notion of commodities when we sort of think about it, right? And so these are everything from wheat to rare metals to gold and oil and gas but I want to pause there and sort of really pose the question to you. What are the commodities of the future? And what are the textures of a new philosophy of commodities?
Okay, starting simple as you always do, Vinod. So I want to firstly start by just underlining your point about this is not just a sort of mathematical change in the world or a price differential change, but why it's a philosophical change. And by philosophical change, I don't mean a piece of text, and I think neither do you. I think what we mean is how we conceive ourselves and our relationship with the world. And that is a conception. It is not truth, it's just a conception which we have reinforced using institutions and logics to create a worldview which has become mutually self-reinforcing. And that conception and our institutional logics have thereby replicated into theories of value, theories of price, theories of commodity, and everything else that we see around us. So it's worth recognizing that linkage, that this is not just that we preference philosophy for the sake of philosophy because we want to talk about this stuff. It's recognizing the failure is rooted at that deep level. And it's also worth recognizing that whether it's plastics or whether it's CO2, whether it's soil erosion or whether it's microplastics in our bloodstreams or whether it's mental health harms,
Mm.
these are all the microviolences that are resultant of that conception of our world landscape, where we understand ourselves in discrete and we optimize for discrete positions and we de-optimize a world around us for the advancement of single point optimizations. So I just think it's really important for, I think, to establish that base of that conversation, because I often find that, we've been trained into an instrumentalized world. We've been trained into a just do it world where the privilege of being able to actually not only just do, but also think, and the
Mm.
symbiosis of those things has been fundamentally broken to advance the instrumentalization of unconfigured thought. And the greatest arbitrage that exists right now is those that can relink philosophy and doing, craft, philosophical craft, will be able to arbitrage value in the future and price as it exists now. So
Mm.
even in the thesis of self-interest,
Right.
this is a self-interested model.
Right.
And so I encourage anyone that's interested in that to partake, not necessarily agree with us, but be open to these conversations as means to understand that arbitrage. Now, and then I think the second part of this conversation that it opens up to specifically get to your question about future commodities is you could argue that we've confused infinite consumables with commodities,
Mm.
and we've correlated those two things. So we've said soil is just a resource, and the resource is going to be there forever, and we can just intensify our farming to consume goods. Our relationship with material is very much the same, and this is rooted in our theory of commodity. You could argue that the true 21st century commodities are going to be intangible goods.
Mm.
They are the true infinite in the system, but they're going to have to be rooted in new theories of relationship with our material biomaterial economies, which is not necessarily through a commodity relationship, but advanced form of stewardship relationships. And by stewardship, I mean a Back to the Future rhyme. I'm not necessarily talking about some romance of a history. I'm also talking about new models of custodianship that are constructed with rights and obligations constructed digitally in other forms of ways of relating to these to these environments. So, for example, um, an electric battery, a network of electric batteries could exist on an open digital trust, and the rights of use of that could be linked from the battery. So you could have a service agreement from that trust to every car, and should that battery fail, the trust would pull it back and drive it to repair. So now you've created an intermediary institutional layer, which is acting as an aggregative agent to allow for circularity and optimize not for waste, for optimized circularity and optimized use of those environments, and not become a rent-seeking system. We are now able to create these new classes of institutional layers which are able to do this supply and demand matching without necessarily becoming rent-seeking systems. So
Mm.
there are new classes of stewardship systems that are going to allow us to move into stewardship economies that exist outside market consumption and production economies. And so we have to look at this transformation as new bureaucratic capabilities that are opening these landscapes up, because this, you can't open it up between so there's been a lot of talk about sort of, sort of electric batteries as services. So you effectively convert it into a quasi-rental system. But what that does is create a rent-seeking system between a bi-party interest. And so we need new types of institutional layers to operationalize stewardship economies. So I would argue on one dimension, we're going to see our commodity layers move into that. So the intangibles, that's very easy to say. And then the second part, which is again work we're starting to do right now, is understand value in a fundamentally different way. So um, let me. So if you look at a tree canopy of a city, the economic benefits of a tree canopy of a city are the economic assets are the effects that are mitigated by that tree canopy and how those effects are matching liability owners. So, for example, if it reduces temperature by 12 degrees in peak load, it reduces your cooling demand demanded by your energy companies, and it reduces their capex requirements, peak load capex requirements. That matching capability has an economic asset value. You don't necessarily have to own the trees. What you own is the economic derivative assets and those rights, and create new classes of economic goods in environments which aren't rooted through classical theories of ownership. You could argue we could capitalize the collective intelligence of a city
Mm,
through similar sorts of models, which are again looking at the derivative rights and the derivative benefits that are accrued. You could look at the mental health of a city as a new form. You could look at the societal decision-making capacity of a city. Um, so I think we're going to, the next class of economic assets are going to be entangled. They're going to be quasi-infrastructure orientated that are going to operationalize in a different way. And I think there's new theories of value, but there's also new theories of commodities, and there's new theories of stewardship. And I think we're going to have to be really smart to be able to break these things up. I also think the other thing that a lot of our work is doing is looking at moving from asset theory to agent theory.
mm,
So so increasingly our capabilities, our technological capabilities, allowing us to organize not only through instruction, but the capacity for learning in the thing itself. And that agentification of the world is then opening up a new dynamic of relationships, which rhymes with history. So the sort of digital animism of the world, which allows us to create new relationalities in the world. So there's a shift from asset to agents. There's a shift to stewardship, entangled goods, and sort of fully intangible goods. And these are operating as quasi-infrastructure level functions. I'm sort of laying that out as a landscape because I think it's in that landscape that we start to see quite a different type of function and quite a different type of economy and quite different governance questions. And they're also rooted in reimagining the nature of the contract. And I think this is
mm,
where, I think the contract is the architecture of the private, the private economy, because the contract is a bilateral relationship based on consideration, whereas actually intentionality and other forms of collaboration cannot be contracted in our current economies. I think we're going to be living in a world um, where we are going to take instruments like credit swap agreements and also bring them into the real world. So rather than they being financial instruments, we're designing a bioregional swap agreement, which looks at taking the debt of farmers and forgiving some of the debt in lieu for more capital investment to support the regenerative transition of farmers, and thereby making the existing credit more durable, more sustainable, and more viable, as well as actually improving the yield of farmers on the basis of moving to regenerative farming frameworks.
mm.
So we're going to see, I think, weirdly, the adoption of some of the tools that are used in the financial system as we start to deploy them and we are able to deal with new forms of digital capabilities, spatial digital capabilities to be able to reorganize our thesis systems. They're multi-agent systems of sharing and organizing value at the individual level, at the network level, at the aggregative level, and the contributory level. And being able to construct these new economic theses is vital to the transition, certainly the coordinated transition that we face.
Right. Okay, that was brilliant, and I've got about sort of 10 pathways in my head and trying to pick where to go next. Um,
Choose your own adventure. It's like,
right? um, I'm gonna start with something that you said at the very outset, and then I'm gonna move to a different get down a different path. Um, you mentioned that we've been in this sort of just do it um, theory, and that in addition to the just do it, we go to sort of just think, and you mentioned that that's a privilege. Do you really feel it's a privilege to just think?
Look, mm, personally, I've lived through, and I think many of us have, you and I have had the privilege of building things, many things, in the course of our careers.
Mm,
Yet, I think both you and I have sometimes been criticized for being thinkers. Um, and I think there's a sort of, I feel it as a privilege because I think it is it is unusual in the world right now for people to be looking at these deep values and deep risks at the structural level. And also, I also feel it as a privilege because I think it's a function of standing on the shoulders and the contributions of many other people and being able to integrate knowledge sort of polymathically across a chain of thought that goes from whether we're talking to people like Forrest Landry or Daniel Schmachtenberger or all the way up, to people talking about new financial models or Raj Kalia and talking about debt swaps, and then talking about new kind of forms of animism and talking to Satsang and Canada or John Burroughs. It's the privilege of being able to operate across these layers, or Katrina Pessoir. It is a privilege to be able to weave knowledge across these disciplines. And I think this is, one of the kind of key privileges is that unfortunately, the nature of the entanglement of our problem space requires us to be able to weave across these disciplines, whether it is
mm,
going from the philosophy to the legal frameworks, to the financing frameworks, to the kind of value theory, to the demand side problems. And yeah, and I don't see, and our problem is that most of our organizational theory are so narrow rooted and narrow designed. So they're
right,
narrowly focused on, you could talk about financing, you could talk about law, but the reality is the problem spaces are entangled all the way through.
right.
And that I think is a privilege to be. I stand on the shoulders of extraordinary people who I've learnt from directly and have had the chance to, communicate and dialogue with directly. And they have systemically been reinforcing, challenging, and developing our thinking. And you know, it's boring, but like I just want to like I suppose maybe it's a ghost I'm fighting, but a simple word like care, right? A simple word like care, which is a simple word, but in a complex entangled world, care as a compute model, in order to care, you have to be able to exist in three levels of compute. You have to understand the I, the self, you have to understand yourself through the other, and you have to understand a third person view of possibilities in that relationship. And it is a three-dimensional compute problem. Just that simple word of care.
Mm,
Our theory of contract is rooted in self-optimization. It is a single point optimizing model and thereby breaks the logic of care in the deep systemic biases of what it's rooted in. It's rooted in transactional theory. So what you have is a failure between the philosophical frameworks that we know are necessary to deal with complexity and the coding of our capital and our flows of arrangements at the root level. Now, unless you can pinpoint that, you can't actually then argue and challenge, well, how do we reimagine contracting, not from being bilateral, but contracting spaces? You
mm,
can't then challenge that, how do you move into agreement spaces and many to many contracts built on shared intentionality. You can't then expand your theory of normative frameworks to drive change, not only relying on laws, but social agreements and social recognition systems and the broad brand of soft and hard norms. So it is in the nuance of being able to weave through this things of just the word care. And care is, without it, we create externalities which are self-distinguishing for us, right? So without the relationship of care and complex entanglements. And I find this, it's just to just to I think to be able to see through this stuff, and I'm not saying I'm right at all. This is always a journey. There's probably much wrong in this, but to be able to make these leaps is important, and be able to make these journeys is important, because that allows you to see the precision of the deep code errors that we're challenged in, and thereby also opens up pathways to us examine different futures. So yes, I feel it. I personally feel it as a privilege, but also mirrored in a responsibility. I think if we have the privilege, we also then hold the responsibility, which is, why you and I do these conversations or other things. And in no way am I suggesting what I'm thinking is the only truth or the truth. It is the best analysis I have available to me yet, and I invite all sorts of discourse.
Right, and this I think is a the sort of the one of the sort of the places my thoughts go to next is this in many ways feels like you know weaving multiple layers and disciplines of of knowledge and experience and perspective. Um, uh, how might this privilege be extended, right? Because who gets to weave is a big question, and um, and in many ways, you look at the sort of the last 200 years or so. Um, the, the 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 there's been a massive push and expectation for knowledge to become very specialized, and you've talked about this a few times. And does it feel to you now that granularity of specialization has it reached the end of its usefulness?
I think it's cyclical. Um, I think I think we go through phases where the intersectionality of knowledge becomes more valuable than the granularity of a particular discipline. And I think we're reaching that phase shift where the value proposition comes at the intersection points of knowledge and disciplines rather than in the disciplines. And I think maybe we reach a new stability period, perhaps a cognitive sort of way of seeing the world, which stabilizes, which then allows us to rediscipline the world. And or maybe this is the new normal and the stability is something else, right? I don't think it'll be the same disciplines. It'll
Right.
be something else, right? There'll be new norms that will stabilize. So I don't see. I see this as an inherent part of a phase shift, and I think one of the big challenges that we've got is made our cognitive development systems are all rooted in historic disciplines, and they're rooted in a practice of disciplines which is actually undermining our polymathic capacities at a structural level, and or I think what we're creating, and I think that the challenge is that this knowledge is a craft challenge. So there's a fundamental knowledge economy problem we're in the middle of, in my view, which is on our economy of knowledge is siloed and fractured, and yet value is going to be constructed at the intersections of that. And what that means is the problem space is always going to be now discovered in craft, where I think we are almost certainly operating where these disciplines intersect and the iterations and the discoveries of the adjacent possibles is discovered in craft.
Mm.
And we've moved into this kind of craft future, intersectional craft future. And that means that there is a problem really of of power, knowledge, capability becoming adjacent to that craft, and privilege also becoming adjacent to the craft.
Mm.
And I think there's something really um, there is and I really like the phrase that's been used of adjacent possibles. And I think what you see is when you operate in the craft, you see the adjacent possibles available to you. And if you're not close to them, you don't see the adjacent possibles.
Right.
So there's a really interesting space of this inherent lock-in of craft and adjacent possibles and privileges it sets up. So there's a kind of interesting question for me about how do you take people operating in craft? How do we all open up the critical adjacent possible spaces that we see and open them up for other people, not actually use them as close privileges? And that I think is really about building the field's capability to grow systemically. Um, and the problem is that, much like yourself, you and I have had careers that have operated across disciplines. We've built impact hubs, we've built social finance vehicles, we've built, sort of been part of building stuff like open source furniture companies, global kind. And as a result of that, we learned how to build a whole bunch of, we were privileged to build some capabilities that are intersectional, that are unusual.
Right.
And and then adjacently, everything we do has opened up possibilities. And I think and this is where I think there's a real talent challenge here. I think, so if you talk to finance people, for example, finance people will say it's a finance problem
Right.
because that's all they see. Um, and the challenge is, sure, it could be a finance problem, but I think it's more a conversion of price to value problem and our ability to contract price to value. It's also a multi-capital problem. It's also like, it's being able to intersectionally see these things is really critical. And I think this is my kind of biggest realization recently. And I think it's part of the reason why I do all these talks, Vinod, if I'm really honest, is to open up as much of what I'm perceiving as quickly as what I'm perceiving. In no way saying I'm right, but at least there is interrogation, at least there's opportunity, at least there is a openness of that. Because I think there is privilege in those frameworks of being able to see certain things and at least open them up. This is the only reason I really do all these conversations, is to keep the system open.
Right. Um, in addition to just having a good time hanging out with me, um,
Done.
uh, uh, but
Choose your own adventure, kind of the space odyssey.
right, right, yeah. Um, so you mentioned lock-ins, and I want to come back to lock-ins because I think um, it's an area that we ought to be exploring and examining further. So I want to come back to that, but I want to sort of look around the world a little bit right now, and in 2024, about 3.5, 4 billion people are going to be voting to transition governments, and not just national governments, but local, state,
Mhm.
etc. And that is one. The vote is one manifestation of the social contract. And so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on, as you were talking about, moving from a commodity relationship to a stewardship relationship. Where does the you know where does the vote factor in, and how does the stewardship relationship become part of perhaps uh, a renewed uh, view of the social contract?
Yeah, I think again here what I think we're living in a two-part problem here. One, I think the thesis of what is sovereign, say the state is sovereign and it's given sovereignty, representative sovereignty by individuals. I think that thesis is broken. I think the sovereignty, democracy is done so well that the only thing sovereign is is citizens and maybe corporations and maybe nature. And I think we are living in a moment when the multitude is more sovereign than the state. And the state is merely a manifestation of the multitude, but not the true or complete manifestation of the multitude. And I think this is where, and state has become a super minority representation of the multitude. And the fracture we're living in is that conceptual fracture. We have tipped from state being a quasi-representative of the multitude to merely being one representation of the multitude.
Mm.
And I don't think the state has quite yet configured this loss of systemic authority. And this authority is not even a loss. It may be actually the evolution of democracy in really powerful forms. So I think one thing is that. And the response to this from the state is, I think, is being the kind of what I'd call the pyramid, the public. We've concentrated the theory of a singular public, singular state, as opposed to seeing states as plural, as multiple publics. And you could argue the judicial system being separated from the defense system, being separated from is actually the idea of plural publics. So I think why it's important is if we can repluralize the public or the state, and we can actually see it as merely one representation of the multitude, I think we start to get to a much healthier conception of the problem and the challenge space that we're facing. And yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
no, but so two questions. One is why are corporates sovereign, and number two, in a world where we have a multitude of publics, though, would we not need a shared values alignment around stewardship?
Yeah, so this is where I think it gets really interesting and challenging. So
Mhm.
um, let's start with, if we just accept there's a multitude, an emergent multitude of sovereignties, and state as representation of collective superminority interests as they're just a representation of those frameworks. I think what it throws up, and I think you're right to ask the question, is rooted in this is a developmental arc. So
Mm.
every democratic transformation has been rooted in a developmental framework. It's no coincidence that industrialization was also, industrial revolution was rooted in educational development and also democratic representation. These things went hand in hand. And I think what we're facing is also developmental investment of human capabilities to match the capacities of the multitude as the emergent place of sovereignties. And I think, so you're right. And the second part is what we're facing is some counter winds, which are mm, uh, new constraint spaces emerging, new landscapes of fragilities, let's use that word, where
Mm.
and I think some of that fragility is a weaponized fragility, because in the weaponization of that fragility, we create landscapes for fear, and fear creates a particular landscape of how multitudes represent and other, and they congeal, they work in a very particular way. So we are increasingly manipulating the context. So democracy is about context shifts and perception shifts of the world, as opposed to the sovereignties of the individual actors as legitimate cognitive agents in the system. So what we're influencing, we're creating bias systems to shift the perception landscapes to order to get the right response from the multitudes. So I think there is a very interesting conversation about the quantum of bias, and I would argue
Mm.
that we've created an economic model rooted in fragility. So our economic model is rooted in construction of economic fragility and freedom, or thesis of freedom, being a function of the economic model. So if you can earn enough money, you can be free. obviously you're never free, but it's a sort of perpetual game. And our economic model is rooted in the construction of fragility, because that fragility allows for the instrumentalization of humans as units of labor.
Mm,
And that thereby creates the fragile landscapes, the cognitive fragile landscapes that actually are now creating the vicious cycles with our theories of democracy and the decision models we're saying. So there is a really complex lock-in between our economic models, the fear as a key weapon in our economic frameworks, as well as the systemic fragilities which are now feedbacking into us from climate breakdown effects, and how they then create a very particular type of super minority response to landscapes of fear, of othering, and the political dimensions we're seeing. So we're locked into a very meta cycle of flows that I think will require quite a major cognitive reflection. So to be able to reflect the whole system back to people, to say, this is what we're locked into. We're locked into this landscape of fear, fragility, increasing fragility, fear, an economic system that rooted in that theory of fear, and how that's making decision models about othering, which is anticipating creating greater violence and disassociation, and thereby increasing our fragility. So we're locked into this vicious circuit. And I think that is the circuit that we have to break. And it is a social economic governance circuit that we're locked into. That is the death, not to be over dramatic, but that is the death spiral we're in right now. Because I think that, and it is that at level. And my challenge, and again, to your listeners, I don't know how many people that are working at the level of social neurology, social neuroscience, economic theory, labor theory, and able to work in these dimensional model spaces, because I think these are the landscapes that are constructing. And look, you and I will laugh, because I suppose here I almost reference Asimov's kind of foundation series, because you almost have to kind of go at that psychogeography landscape of kind
right,
of operation to be able to see these patterns. But the patterns are there,
right.
and they are visible, and they are being used, right? So it's not that they're not being used; they are being weaponized, and yet we don't have cognitive discourse to be able to talk about it. I don't think. I've not seen it yet.
Yeah, and I would perhaps take that a bit further. Agree with all that you said, and perhaps take that a bit further. And I'd probably sort of say that uh, in the sort of the weaponization of fragility, one of the biases that is fairly prominent is our self-justification bias. And this is where we take an action and then create a moral argument for why we took that action, right? And so one of the sort of the cycles that I also find ourselves in is a bit of a morality trap, where we're increasingly insulating ourselves from multiple from the weaving from multiple viewpoints and perspectives, and part of that, the part of the reaction to that is the fear, and then you end up sort of alienating and vilifying and demonizing, especially people who don't believe in the same things you believe in, right? And that, you know, and in many ways you can kind of look back at the last 150 years or so, and the types of factors that have driven progress, at scale in society, and there's been, kind of look back at sort of the period of Renaissance, and the type of progress, and what drove progress there, and then is you got imperialism driven progress and all this type of stuff. And one of the sort of the observations I have, and perhaps it's a bit of a thesis, is I wonder if part of what we're in now is an era of a lot of guilt driven progress, and and this is it's actually getting to be quite a dangerous cycle we're in. So
Yeah, no, I hear you, and I think the reality is we are undoubtedly going to have to acknowledge and address the many violences to which we are party of, and to which we have been witness of, and to which we have been victims of. And I would argue that perhaps most of us in either our lineages and histories have been affected in either three of those methods. Perhaps you and our own histories have some of those in them as well. And the challenge for us is we are going to have to, yes, acknowledge those violences and also release ourselves from the trauma of those violences to not pass those violences on. My fear is that our experience of violences, whether you're victim or perpetrator, is actually creating a pass-through of that violence. And the work that we have, the real work that's required, is our capacity to not pass that trauma on to another generation. And I don't mean
pass on the guilt, because now in addition there's an intergenerational transmission of guilt.
yeah, and I think there is. I suppose I'm to be in dominion over is a form of violence in itself, and the
Mhm.
perpetrator and the dehumanization of yourself. I'm kind of not that interested in that guilt, if I'm really honest. I think there's a self-weaponization that occurs that dehumanizes yourself. And in the process, you dehumanize your kids and the environments around you, and you build dehuman organizations that actually pass forward that trauma. And I think that there's an effect on both sides, which actually, and the challenge for us as a civilization, as a planetary civilization, is unfortunately, if we are pass on this trauma in either sides, we will self-terminate.
Mm.
Right. And that I think the sooner we realize that collectively as a species, and as a civilization, the greater our chance of survival. And I think we're still trying to prove who's right, not recognize maybe we're all wrong in different ways. And you know what I mean? Like
Right.
we're still fighting the child's game.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it might just lead us over the precipice, just to figure out whether you're right or right. Well, if you fall off the cliff, it doesn't kind of matter at the other side. So I think there's something quite extraordinary required. Um, and also recognizing we're all, in some ways, participatory, involved in the violence to many future generations in the process, right? So human, non-human systems, all of that sort of stuff. So yeah, I do wonder, somebody sort of said whether empathy was a useful emotion. I do wonder whether guilt is a useful emotion. I do wonder whether compassion and care and to break our own traumas is the greatest gift we can give each other, because that will allow us to all thrive in a way that's historically not possible.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I think the one of the things that sort of brings up for me is this question of lock-ins, and particularly sort of um, lock-in of values, and because I think there is a really interesting question here around um, what if we're creating future lock-ins, and when I sort of think about the you know the values that would guide humanity into the future, um, what are those values, and how locked in are we already, right?
Um, See, I think this is. I'm not a foundationalist. Um, I think too many people, for me, end up trying to define what it means to be human. Say humans are selfish gene or whatever, some foundational truth, and thereby extrapolate that foundational truth, and thereby prove the world through that foundational thesis. Mm, I think what makes humans really fascinating is that we are able to symbiotically construct the environment that constructs us. And we are uniquely at the scale that we do it, able to do this symbiotic developmental model. And the question is, are we symbiotically co-developing our environment to ennoble us or control us and trap us?
Mm.
And I think the law can be a thesis of ennoblement or it can be a thesis of entrenchment of the rights of the existing. This is a choice. And often we confuse law and justice. Law is a lagging framework. It is usually an entrenchment of normative values, and justice is the thing that breaks through the law to cast a new legal framework of the future. So for me, there is a kind of not a deeper conversation, but there's a conversation about how we think about this stuff at a much deeper rooted level. So I think if we can break through what we imagine to be the next justice, the next ennoblement, I think we can have the capacity to create the conditions to ennoble us. And in that process, we break this idea of some foundational reality of humans, which I think has been the I'm not well read enough about it, but I have to say personally, I say this as an individual. Whenever somebody says, "Well, this is a foundational truth," I always think I'm just about to be sold a quasi Hitler trap. I'm sorry to use that word, but it's this idea of historic perfection is a
Right.
trap.
Hmm.
And I have a red flag that comes up in my face because I believe that humanity can be ennobled, and I think laws can be designed to ennoble us, not to entrap us. We can construct justice to actually unleash us. I think that's a completely different thesis of an ennobling environment that we construct to make us better rather than just to constrain the worst of us. And I think too often we've coded the environment to constrain the worst of us rather than unleash and ennoble us. And those are choices. Those are
Right.
developmental, philosophical choices of how we imagine ourselves. And I think goes back to our, initial conversation. What is the philosophical root? And books like Humankind and other things have shown vast amounts of evidence that humans have a predilection for kindness and generosity, and the selfish meme was just that a sort of reductive comprehension of the total humanity of us, and thereby legitimizing a particular stakeholder capitalism, um, sort of worldview that allowed for a particular cognitive worldview to give resonance through the illusion of science, right? So I don't know. I'm sorry if that's a bit of a loop, but I'm
No, because in many ways, like one of the things that I hear often is when people talk about the future, it sounds like sometimes that they want to go back to the past, right? And so I wonder about that, right? And where the picture that is often painted is the perfection of the past, and right, and so and if all of this effort, is really to go back to the past, um, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. So
and I
um,
I have to say I would encourage every listener, as soon as you hear that, put up a red flag because there was perhaps no time in history that was that, right? And I agree with you. I have many red flags, and I think, and every dictator has rooted their truism on some historic truth, which I think has always been um, a reductionism of human to some theory of essentialism, which is, I think, much more beautiful, is the ennobling and the flourishing capacity of all of our humanity. And I don't even think we've begun to see that yet.
Right.
I think there's we're at the cusp of, um, you could argue in the long arc, the planet has been gestating a consciousness, and the planet has used up vast amounts of energy to construct an 8 billion scale multitude consciousness. That's what it's used, right?
Right.
And it's a gestation of that, and to construct this extraordinary consciousness. So if you take a James Lovelock worldview for a moment, I think it's quite liberating to see it through that lens,
Mm.
because I think we stop demonizing ourselves whilst acknowledging that we have been party violence. So, but it also is important to hold these multiple viewpoints together, because I
Right.
think there's damage in only seeing the harm.
Right. Um, let's take this kind of into the future, and expand on multiple viewpoints and worldviews, because um, with the proliferation of AI tools all over the place, and it I might say something that's a bit edgy, perhaps, but the more I use GPT, I feel like it's actually getting dumber, and so and getting more homogenous, getting dumber, and this this homogeneity, I think, is actually going to become a problem. And if the trajectory of this is that it actually becomes less smart as more people input into its learning model, um, where might that actually leave us? And so because on one hand, we are we're on the journey of reconceptualizing and reframing and imagining new theories of value, stewardship, commodities, all of it. And then here we have perhaps one of the biggest and most significant leaps in the last few decades. Call it artificial intelligence, call it synthetic intelligence, what have you. Um, the intelligence actually is looking like it's becoming more and more homogenous by the day. What do you make of that?
Um, I'm sort of slightly mm, resistant to the kind of mm, this is going to destroy the world, or this is going to take over the world, or I'm resistant to all those um, logics that have been put out around, you know, LLM models and various other things. I think that's one thing. Just and yeah, I'm resistant to that. I mm, More and more the conversations I'm part of mm, recognize that universal intelligences are going to be different from situational intelligences. So situational intelligences are rooted in space temporal relationalities, and they are also rooted in emotional technical intelligences, if to only use two. So I think what we're seeing is a shift from universality to situationality
Mm,
and relationality. So, and that's what human intelligence will become more and more powerful at, and the shift towards our capabilities. Um, Second, I think what ChatGPT does is raises the bar. I think it's sort of
oh, over to you. Demonstrate. Right.
yeah, exactly right,
Yeah.
and which frankly I find quite refreshing.
Mm,
actually. I think it's, weirdly enough, I was worried about the mass pollution landscape. And actually, what it's done for me is almost made the pollution layer invisible because there's so much of it, but the refinement layer more obvious because you can see what it requires for situational intelligence.
Right.
And universal intelligence, situational intelligence is so variant. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I think, like I was saying, that I think we use the word intelligence is one thing, but I think intelligence is a function of embodiment as well, which is embodied intelligence is different from unembodied intelligence. What I mean by that is in embodied intelligence, you have an idea of dialogic relationships with the
Mm.
world, both in conversation but in physical embodiments. And that builds a form of craft intelligence that universal intelligence doesn't have. So I think there's a whole dialogic capacity that becomes really, and I don't just mean words, I mean embodied dialogics, that becomes really critical. I also think that in compute capacity, the recognition of self in space, spatially and temporally, the multitude that is I, we, exists, but also I compute at the level of mirror neurons, as in a relationship of how other people perceive me. And then I also compute with logics and frameworks of the third person as well. So I think what human intelligence can do is operate at these three computes simultaneously
Mm.
that allow us to perceive a form of consciousness that I think is really powerful. So I think we're nowhere close. If
Right.
you want my, like, I think this is like saying the car is the human body. Like, it's that reductive. Sure, the car will out be faster than us, but it's not the human body, right? And in no way am I demeaning what's done. I think it's extraordinary. I think it's incredible, and it will revolutionize the world. But I think it's a misconflation. The conflation is not accurate, and I think what it will allow for is a new capacity of flourishing of human capabilities. And as the Industrial Revolution, mm, I think, invited for a new type of humanity, I think this will require a new human development capabilities function. So I suppose and then even LLM models like the conversations we're in the middle of
Mm.
are just playfully, again, just for friends, how do you build um, a large language scale model rooted in the taxonomies and the weighting systems of Venice? So not the weighting systems of San Francisco around the world, but the
Right.
weighting systems of Venice.
Right.
And and I think we're going to see some really lovely things start to happen as people start to create and understand this world through those type of particularities and situationalities. And because remember, language is a frame to see the world. So if you only see the world through a San Francisco worldview extrapolated, I think we have destroyed vast amounts of value. Whereas I think the available landscape is extrapolations of all sorts of what is the Venetian worldview, and how does it extrapolate, and what is the particularity of a model worldview that's rooted in, from 17th century or 15th century and 16th century frameworks of thinking all the way upwards. And how do you build that weighting system? How do you build those LLM models? Again, maybe even rooted on some of the logic models that we're seeing with the large language scale model. So I think there are more interesting particular futures that are going to emerge that are more than the dominant landscapes that we're talking about.
Yeah. And
Certainly, that's the experiment space we're playing in.
right. Yeah. And I think that's fascinating. I do also think that we're going to see a plurality of LLMs, and in all kinds of
And
all kinds of contexts. And I think this is going to become a really, really interesting culture building space.
exactly.
Yeah,
I think culture. I think this is it. You know, you know, you know, we're both going to be in Quebec. If Quebec does not build a large language model rooted in Quebec culture, it's lost the language war. I mean, just in a culture war sense. So
mm,
I'm really interested, when does Quebec pick up the mantle and kind of go, all right, then let's play? If it really believes so strongly as it does in the preservation of Francophone culture, I'm kind of like, where is it? Where is this new cultural investment that I want to see? When is Quebec going to invest 200 billion into actually, right, let's go for this? And I
right,
think this is going to be interesting. But I also think that most of my understanding is that these are going to be layered models, not necessarily new foundational models. So what we're going to see is layering of these taxonomies and the weighting systems as one after another. Now that will create problems, because in the act of layering you create systemic biases and the weightings of those things. But I think that's going to be part of the challenge, because I don't think many people are going to have the capacity to do foundational models at the scale and the energy and the compute that's available.
right. Unless it's a completely different sort of conception of
Sure.
LLMs, right? And so because
Which is also will happen
which is
eventually.
also, I think, will happen and probably should happen. And you could say the same thing about you know you know indigenous LLMs,
Sure.
and we probably need an indigenous OpenAI, as an
Sure.
example. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. And remember, there's not one single indigenous worldview. So like
Right.
there are many nations, there are multiple indigenous worldviews. So I think this, how we build towards this plurality, I think is going to be really interesting. And I think my gut feeling is we're going to see one or two cities and one or two places make this play. So if I was Venice, call out to my Venetian friends, I would make this play. Like it's ultimately a cultural product, and the construction of this new cultural infrastructure is a key asset of the 21st century. So how do you build these new forms of assets? I think is going to be fascinating and really critical.
Right. And back to some of what we were talking about around sovereignty. I think these would actually become sovereign entities, in of themselves.
Well,
Um,
I would argue they should be structured as public interest trusts, um,
hmm. Why is that?
um, because I think they are going to require capitalization, they're going to require risk, but their effect on society, and they are genuinely centralized general purpose technologies, that they have such a systemic effect that they need to be situated as public interest trusts, which are operating in the public interest. They are capitalized, they have returns on capital, but are predominantly operating for the public interest. And I think they can be capitalized in really interesting ways. They can be then thereby conceived as agents, or agents in the system, so agent self-sovereign systems. And if you do that, then they have to take on board a thesis of mutual development and theories of flourishing. So in an agent worldview, you have to also embody the responsibility of co-flourishing and a different worldview. So there's a whole stack of new capacities as you move into that worldview as well that are essential.
Right. Indy, we've it's been a phenomenal hour and a half here, and moved around so many different places. And I think there is a um, uh, these are the types of conversations that really stretch me, and also I think take me to new destinations intellectually, and emotionally. And so thank you again for creating the space and time for being a part of this. It's a collaboration that I deeply value, and looking forward to doing this again very very soon. The I just wanted to sort of like come back to some of the pieces that we started with, and and one of the things that you started off with was this new notion of intangibles. And when in relation to the proliferation of LLMs, um, in like what's how do you begin to see the intangibility of these types of models around the world, because it really feels like this is
Yeah.
where we are.
So, um, so I think a really useful device of looking at an intangible for me is the collective intelligence of a place. Because the collective intelligence of a place is a function of institutional frameworks, human systems, human capabilities, machine systems, machine capabilities, and the amplification function as a constellation, the
Right.
portfolio function. And when you start to looking at that through that lens, it starts to reimagine value away from discrete individuals to this population level entangled value. There's non-divisible, right? So it's not that I'm brilliant, it's I'm functioning part of a much larger system to which actually I am a contributor, but also there's a collective function to it, or an entangled function, not a collective function. And I think I find these things, one of the things one of the works we're doing is what would be the radical balance sheets of a 21st century place?
Mm.
And I would argue the balance sheets of a 21st century place will be a material balance sheet, the material flows it can circulate and keep circling. It will be the biomaterial carrying capacity of the system and the regen. That'd be great. I think it will be the decision-making capacity of that society,
Mm.
the capability of society to make decisions in volatility, in complex, uncertain landscapes. How does that society make? That will be an asset. The energy infrastructure will obviously be an asset. And then you will talk about the maybe a foundational will be the mental health of that city will be it. And then the collective intelligence will be another form. So
Mm.
now imagine a balance sheet of a place constructed in that way,
Right.
which I think is sounds far future, but if you go to my thesis of the arbitrage between value and price,
Right.
I would argue where I've allocated the balance sheet is a closer attribution to where value lies than what we're currently pricing.
Right. Because you didn't mention property once.
Precisely.
Right.
Precisely. Because I would argue that property is the privatization of entangled value.
Mm.
So, you know, you live in Toronto, take a house in Toronto, move it to Siberia. How much is the house worth? Not very much. So what we're really talking about is the monopolistic access that that land provides to labor markets, to transportation, to cultural goods, to sovereignties, all sorts of it is, and the increase in value of that house over the last 20 years,
Mm.
10x value, is not a function of any great contribution from you or anyone else. It's a function of those intangibles, societal intangibles that are appreciated in value relative to global instability. And thereby, that has been entirely captured by the existing landowners.
Right.
Those intangibles have been artificially, this is the new enclosure, right? It is the enclosure at that level. And we've created a lock-in of dependency, a false attribution of value to a whole class of us, which have captured those intangible values. And that's why I didn't mention property at all. What I mentioned was a whole class of other goods,
Right.
because actually that is how we're going to unlock value in the 21st century. We're going to have to need a new energy infrastructure, which is deeply renewable and surplus. We're going to need a new biomaterial, biomaterial, but also bio services infrastructure. We're going to need new forms of water, energy. There's a whole stack, cognitive capabilities, all of that stuff. These are the balance sheets of society that are going to construct value. These are the infrastructure of the 21st century.
And last question, and then we're going to sort of
Sure.
wrap here. But um, what is the path that you see to decommodifying property? Because right now, as it stands, it's something that you can have on a marketplace, you can trade, and it's a speculative asset. So what is the path that you see to, because this currently exists on every city's balance sheet, right? What is the path that you see um, to removing it or reassigning it? Um,
I think it's a slow defanging of that economy.
mm,
I think um, and it is not easy because of the dependencies that we've created on that, whether it's pensions, people long-term economic livelihood,
right.
economic survivals. It will be a slow defanging, and the defanging will happen through the need for investment in critical common goods, energy, water, um, nature infrastructures. And
Health.
as
Yeah.
we start health, as we start to invest into those, we will start to see a shift of value and attribution of value over time. And
Mm,
this is actually, and I think that is the only way to slowly defang the economy, as it's currently weaponized. And if we don't do that, we'll see a constraint in investment in those spaces, which will actually defang the economy because vulnerabilities and social tipping points will be reached. So,
right.
so there'll be a forcing function or an enabling function. But either way, I think those things are on the table.
Right. Beautiful. Indy, thank you so much. Really appreciate the time again, and look forward to doing this again very soon.
Absolute pleasure, my friend, and thank you for everything for you're doing. And it's important that we do this. And one thing I was going to say is I really thank everyone for being patient to go through this conversation with us. But I do think it's important that we take these arcs together, Vinod, because I think these arcs are really critical for people. And whether it's our arcs, disagreements, I'm not saying that people should agree with us, but I do think it's important that they take these arcs. And in the act of following these arcs, I think it's going to be critical in the work that's required and the transformations that are necessary. So I really appreciate you holding space for these sorts of things, and I think it's really vital that you hold space. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.